In a courtroom where justice often clashes with power, a man named Daniel Wellington III entered like a conqueror, his every step radiating arrogance and entitlement. Dressed in a $15,000 custom-tailored Italian suit, he strutted into Judge Judy's courtroom as though he owned not just the building, but everyone inside it. His wrist bore a Patek Philippe watch, a symbol of wealth worth more than most people's homes. The sound of his $3 Southern leather shoes echoed on the polished marble floor, each step a reminder of his belief that money could solve anything. He adjusted his diamond cufflinks, the glint in his eyes matching his wealth. Confidence, bordering on arrogance, surrounded him like an impenetrable shield. Daniel Wellington was not just any man. He was a billionaire hedge fund manager with a fortune of $3.2 billion. His influence spanned the globe, owning penthouses in Manhattan, London, and Dubai. His private jet was worth more than many hospitals, and his annual income exceeded the GDP of some small countries. Yet, he stood in Judge Judy's courtroom, facing charges for something unimaginable, an act of violence against his elderly housekeeper, Maria Gonzalez. Maria, a 67-year-old grandmother who had worked for Daniel for 8 years, had requested her wages after months of unpaid work. She had earned $18,000, but her employer had ignored her for 3 months. When she finally mustered the courage to ask for the money she was owed, Daniel's response was brutal. He shoved her down a flight of stairs in his luxurious Manhattan penthouse, resulting in a broken hip and wrist for Maria. When the paramedics arrived, they found Daniel casually complaining about incompetent staff rather than showing concern for the elderly woman lying in pain on the floor. To make matters worse, Daniel attempted to bribe the police officers who arrived on the scene. He pulled out his wallet and offered each officer $50,000 to forget the whole incident. His arrogance knew no bounds. He told the police that he donated more to the police commissioner's charity in one night than the officers made in an entire year, as if his wealth could erase the crime he had just committed. Despite his best efforts, the officers arrested him. Shocked by his blatant disregard for the law, Daniel's arrogance only grew in the courtroom. He entered with 5 of the best corporate attorneys money could buy, each charging $800 an hour. As he made his way to the defendant's table, he even joked with his lawyers, asking how much Judge Judy cost, as though judicial decisions were up for sale. But Judge Judy was not impressed. She had spent 40 years dealing with entitled millionaires and billionaires who thought their wealth could exempt them from the law. Daniel was about to learn a painful lesson that money couldn't fix. The moment he entered the courtroom, Daniel's arrogance was palpable. His $15,000 suit caught the attention of everyone in the room, but it was his behavior that drew the most disdain. As he made his way to the defendant's table, he barely acknowledged Judge Judy, glancing at her only briefly before returning to his phone. Judge Judy's expression hardened immediately. "Mr. Wellington, I expect you to address this court properly and put that phone away," she said, her voice calm but firm. Daniel responded dismissively, rolling his eyes as if her command was an inconvenience. Judge Judy, who had seen her fair share of entitled defendants, was not easily impressed. As she reviewed the charges, felony assault, wage theft, obstruction of justice, and attempted bribery, she looked up at Daniel with a quiet intensity. "Mr. Wellington, you're charged with violently attacking your 67-year-old housekeeper, Maria Gonzalez, causing her to fall downstairs, resulting in a broken hip and wrist." "How do you plead?" Daniel, still dismissive, smirked and shrugged. "Your Honor, I think we're wasting time here. This is a simple labor dispute," the courtroom murmured in disbelief. "A labor dispute?" Daniel had shoved a woman down the stairs, and yet he was trying to downplay the gravity of the situation. Judge Judy leaned forward, her tone steely. "She was asking for 3 months of unpaid wages," she said. Daniel continued to dismiss the issue, saying it was about principle, not the money. He claimed he would have simply written a check if money was the issue, as if $18,000 was mere pocket change. His lack of empathy for the elderly woman's suffering was evident, and his response only added to the tension in the room. As Judge Judy continued to press him, Daniel's arrogance began to crack. He attempted to justify his actions by mentioning the substandard performance of his housekeeper. He claimed that Maria had broken expensive items and forgotten tasks, painting her as an incompetent employee. Judge Judy, however, was not moved by his justifications. "You pushed her down the stairs," she reminded him, her voice firm. At this point, Daniel's confidence began to waver, but he still maintained a sense of superiority. He began to talk about how much money he made and how many people he employed. "I employ 47 people across my properties," he said. as if this somehow gave him the right to treat his staff poorly. Judge Judy, however, was having none of it. "Your wine budget is irrelevant to these proceedings," she retorted, shutting him down completely. Then came the game-changing moment. Judge Judy ordered the security footage from Daniel's penthouse to be shown in court. Daniel's attempts to stop the footage from being played were met with resistance from Judge Judy, who was determined to get to the truth. "I'm interested in the truth," she said firmly. The footage showed Maria nervously approaching Daniel, asking for her paycheck. It captured Daniel's cold dismissal of her, as well as his enraged response when she mentioned calling the labor board. The most shocking moment came when Daniel shoved Maria down the stairs, the camera catching every horrifying detail. The courtroom was stunned into silence as the footage played. Maria was clearly seen falling, her body tumbling down the stairs, hitting each step with sickening thuds. She lay at the bottom of the stairs, crying out in pain while Daniel, instead of helping, made phone calls about damage control. The paramedics and police officers who arrived on the scene were horrified by Daniel's lack of compassion. His attempt to bribe the officers only added to the severity of his actions. When the footage ended, the entire courtroom sat in stunned silence. Maria sobbed in the gallery, reliving the trauma. Daniel, however, remained cold and unmoved. Judge Judy addressed him, asking what he had to say for himself after watching the footage. His response was chilling. "That footage requires context," he said, trying to dismiss the evidence. He claimed that the force of the shove was minimal and that any injury Maria sustained was due to her own lack of coordination, but Judge Judy wasn't buying it. "Mr. Wellington, you pushed a 67-year-old woman down the stairs," she said firmly, her voice rising with each word. "I'm prepared to impose significant penalties that will teach you the difference between power and accountability." At this point, Daniel's arrogance reached new heights. He tried to threaten Judge Judy, reminding her of his wealth and connections. He claimed he could ruin her career, citing his influence with the mayor, governor, and other politicians. But Judge Judy wasn't intimidated. She had dealt with powerful people before, and she wasn't about to let Daniel's threats sway her judgment. "Mr. Wellington, I've seen millionaires, celebrities, and powerful people try to intimidate me. It has never worked, and it will not work today," Judge Judy said, her voice calm but unyielding. Daniel's threats were futile. He had underestimated Judge Judy's resolve, and now he was to pay the price for his arrogance. In the end, Judge Judy sentenced Daniel to the maximum penalty of $50, Susan fine, and 2 years in state prison for felony assault. For wage theft, he was ordered to pay Maria $180,000, 10 times what he had stolen from her, plus her medical expenses. He also faced a $100 fine and an additional year in prison for attempting to bribe police officers. Finally, for contempt of court, Judge Judy imposed a $500,000 fine and 2 more years in prison. Daniel's empire began to crumble as soon as the verdict was announced. His wealth, influence, and connections could not protect him from the consequences of his actions. In the hours following the verdict, Wellington Capital Management lost $8 billion in investor withdrawals. Daniel's name, once synonymous with wealth and power, was now linked to corruption, cruelty, and arrogance. As he was escorted out of the courtroom, Daniel's life, as he knew it, was over. His wealth couldn't fix the damage he had caused. He was no longer a billionaire hedge fund manager. He was inmate number 847392. Justice had prevailed, and the most expensive mistakes are often those that no amount of money can undo.